Good afternoon and welcome to MedCity Invest Precision Medicine. I'm Stephanie Baum, Director of Special Projects with MedCity News. Before we get started with our interoperability panel, I'd just like to give you some background on MedCity News. MedCity News was founded in late 2008 to cover innovation in life sciences and healthcare. We cover biopharma, digital health, medical devices, diagnostics, as well as hospitals and payers in the context of the industry's overall transformation. In addition to Invest Precision Medicine, we host conferences focusing on investment, population health, digital health, and patient engagement. We accept outside content through our MedCity Influencers program. We also have a program geared for startups, a membership-based program called Med Citizens, which features editorial and event benefits. If you are interested in more information about that program, you can contact me at sbaum@medcitynews.com. We also have a podcast series called MedCity Pivot. You can listen to all our episodes on our website. If you're interested in learning more about this program and potentially participating in it, you can contact our editor-in-chief, Arundhati Parmar, at aparmar@medcitynews.com. We also have a program that we've just launched called MedCity News Spotlight, where we spotlight, as part of our conferences and to augment panel discussions and presentations. MedCity News Spotlight uses video to tell the story of important companies, executives, and healthcare initiatives. For our first spotlight, we are featuring Cancer IQ and how it's advancing precision medicine. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event: Independence Blue Cross, the largest healthcare organization in Southeast Pennsylvania, and who's sponsored a number of MedCity events. And I'd also like to thank JPOD at the University of Pennsylvania. I'd also like to thank our partners, University City Science Center, MHIN, Health Wildcatters, Startup Health, and Argo Pond Consulting. So our panel this afternoon is Interoperability Progress Report. Our moderator is Elise Reuter, our senior reporter at MedCity News. Elise it covers insurance and digital health. She's covered healthcare and technology for her career, which has included reporting for the San Diego Business Journal and the Kansas City Business Journal. Originally from Colorado, she enjoys hiking, skiing, and watching KU basketball in her free time. We also have as speakers our panel. Kevin Chaney is the Senior Program Manager with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. He is Senior Program Manager for the Chief Scientist Division within the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. He supports ONC's Precision Medicine Initiative and patient-centered outcomes research activities, as well as ONC's leading edge acceleration projects in its Health IT program. Prior to joining ONC, Mr. Chaney was at the Federal Office for Rural Health Policy. Kevin was previously a program manager for the Health IT portfolio at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, where he managed more than $50 million in extramural programs and projects to generate new knowledge about improving the quality and efficiency of healthcare delivery through the use of Health IT. Kevin earned a master's degree in gerontology from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Next, another speaker on the panel is Dr. Ida Sim, with a Ph.D. and professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. Ida Sim is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she co-directs informatics and research innovation at UCSF's Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute and is director of digital health for the Division of General Internal Medicine. She is a global leader in the policy and technology of large-scale sharing of clinical trials and mobile health data. In 2011, she co-founded OpenM Health, a nonprofit organization that is breaking down barriers in mobile health app and data integration through an open software architecture. In 2017, she co-founded Vivly, a global data sharing platform for finding, requesting, and analyzing participant-level clinical trials data. Dr. Sim is a recipient of the United States Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, a fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics, a member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation, and is a practicing primary care physician. And finally on our panel, we have Niko Skievaski, co-founder and president of Redox. Niko got his start in healthcare technology at Epic, where he taught healthcare economics and saw firsthand how the need to solve interoperability is one of the biggest challenges facing healthcare today. In 2014, he co-founded Redox, which has quickly grown into an industry-leading integration platform supporting interoperability for hundreds of healthcare organizations. He's the co-founder of 100 State, Wisconsin's largest co-working space, and creator of Struck by Orca, healthcare's pivotal book on ICD-10. Niko has degrees in economics from Arizona State and Boston University and lives in Boulder, Colorado with his partner, toddler, and collection of mountain bikes. And now I'll hand it over to you, Elise.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I think we'll have a great discussion. And I also wanted to thank each of our panelists, Ida, Kevin, and Niko. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspectives today. So as the name might indicate today, I really wanted to talk about how we are doing and where we are today with interoperability. I know at the beginning of the year, we saw the rollout of new information blocking rules, and at the same time, the pandemic hit the US. And I think if anything is clear in the last few months, the need to be able to share health information has become very clear. So I wanted to ask each of our panelists just for their general impressions of how we're doing today, just to start off our conversation. So Kevin, why don't we start with you, since you sort of have an inside view with your work at the ONC?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And I also want to thank MedCity and the folks, as well as our fellow panelists, to talk about obviously a very important topic, and kind of looking at more some of the nuances related to it. And certainly from an interoperability standpoint, and as maybe seen by my bio, I've done quite a work on the government end, from funding and at least trying to support health IT infrastructure development, research over the last decade. And I must say, we've come a long way in that last decade. We've certainly made a lot of progress, and that helps certainly with, starting with the HITECH Act or the Recovery Act back in 2009. And it really kind of was impetus in the push to get more providers and hospitals using not just electronic health records, but then moving towards certified electronic health records, which is the business that ONC is in and regulating. And those on joining us today might be aware of ONC, and as you alluded to, some of our rules that came out as far as what does these EHR technologies need to have moving ahead. What should they be able to do and support in certain functionalities, which is critical for interoperability, but also for things like innovation and I think competition as well, which is always good, which can also help further innovation. So ONC, I won't run through, I think, some of like the numbers because they're rapidly changing. ONC does a great job of trying to coming out with certain briefs and data points on a regular basis that can give kind of a where the state of the state is. But I think it certainly is rapidly changing. And with the introduction of ONC's Cures Act final rule over the next 2 years, and we did come out with an interim final rule that kind of put a delay on when some of the enforcements would be for some of the activities within that rule as a result of COVID-19, obviously a major challenge we're all facing and still currently face. But the idea behind the rules is a couple of things, kind of two important things: information blocking, and then ensuring that individuals, myself or others, have access to their electronic health record data and core components of it, which used to be called our Common Clinical Data Set. Meaningful Use Stage 3 is now going to be called the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability. But essentially, it's set of data in which a certified electronic health record is, it's being captured by, and these certified EHRs have to be able to support APIs or application programming interfaces, which allows, individuals to use their phone, even on the web, can connect to these APIs and are able then to securely access and share that electronic health data for whatever the purposes may be. That's great. And as far as interoperability goes, the way I kind of look at it is it's by kind of pushing and utilizing these standards, we raise all boats. And when we look up, what's the ceiling kind of look like? Well, with the US CDI and the work that we're going to be doing there is ONC is constantly intaking information, comments, as well as looking at ways that we can expand that data set that is going to be interoperable, or at least, people will be able to access and share, and for a lot of different purposes. And that's on a singular basis, but also provision in there, I think, which was put together with tremendous foresight by our leadership and led by our national coordinator, Dr. Reuter, was the bulk data API. And I think that's going to also have a big transformative effect for a lot of purposes. And I think we're actually seeing, some of our medical centers that are early on the scene using bulk data API is sharing data with other centers and have been doing it, and for instance, to learn more about COVID. So again, I think this is it's going to be critically important for us to be able to, hopefully over the next 2 years, which is kind of the process for when these rules are going to be in force. So, by 2022, 2023, we're going to see, I think, some of this the fruits of our labor that, especially right now, we are, rushing to get done. We'll see that more evenly across the country, which will be great.
I'm looking forward to seeing what happens over the next couple of years. And I definitely do want to talk more about the use of APIs and that later in this conversation. But I also wanted to turn it over to you, Ida, from your perspective with the work that you've been doing with interoperability, and also your perspective as a physician. How are we doing right now? What have you seen?
I think on the big picture, the state of interoperability is improving, and I think with the recent ONC rules, as Kevin went over, hopefully that trend is accelerating. I think we still certainly have a long way to go, but very encouraging movement. As a practicing clinician, I'd say my life is really embedded within my electronic health record, which happens to be Epic at UCSF, and so I think I get getting access from other health systems that are already on Epic through Care Everywhere has been really tremendous. Life is so much better, in the last several years, that is a really routine thing. And also data from LabCorp and Quest are directly piped into, our usual lab reporting. And so that streamlines the workflow tremendously. There are still obviously places where data doesn't come in. It comes in as a fax and ends up, in some place somewhere where there's, have to load up a piece of paper and scroll through it, and that's challenging, but hopefully that will improve. So I think as a practicing clinician, it's working pretty well. But as soon as you get out of that, as soon as a person goes to a different locale, or maybe they came from, they changed insurance and they came from a different, then it falls apart. So I think there are localized situations where interoperability is working reasonably well, but it's not a system kind of thing. It's not a system-wide thing. And that's why I think the ONC rules are really important. We should be thinking about interoperability as a system and not just those who are on a particular, EHR or a particular, system, I think. So I think that's really exciting and promising. I would say my particular interest, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, is using those APIs to get data into the hands of individual patients and what that might open up. So I'll leave that as a teaser. I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Yes, I definitely want to talk about that too. And Niko, I know that you have a unique perspective with your work with Redox, kind of having the perspective between health systems and the software vendors that they work with. So I would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, certainly. I think that we've come a really long way as far as interoperability goes, even in the past 5 years. I like to think of interoperability in kind of 3 buckets. The first being what people traditionally think about with interoperability, having data follow a patient from one care setting to another. As Ida mentioned, we've seen tremendous advancements there with EHRs really opening up, really driven by the demand of health systems, joining nationwide networks like Care Quality, Commonwealth. Those will hopefully create networks that are interoperable between EHRs, so a patient seen in whatever care setting can get the data to the providers they need. So that's kind of like the first bucket of interoperability that I look at. The bucket that Redox really focuses on is getting data from the EHR to applications that health systems use. And I think that, if we look at the last decade, the kind of meaningful use era of the last decade of adopting EHRs, we've really come out of that into a mature state of EHR adoption, where now that the data has been digitized, health systems are trying to figure out, how do we actually surround that electronic health record with applications to meet all of the needs of all the patient populations we look at and the different corners of the healthcare delivery system that have really different workflows. So we've seen an explosion of digital health applications. And that's driven a lot of the demand for increased interoperability to those applications. So that's where we're seeing a ton of progress being made. EHRs are opening up API app stores where applications can connect to. There's a lot of companies that are turning into kind of middle layers, to Redox included, to power that ecosystem of those applications. And there's been a ton of investment money from the venture capital communities going into startups to generate these digital health applications, to really drive innovation on not only workflow improvement within the healthcare system, but also how care is being delivered from a virtual setting. And I'm sure we'll probably talk about the pandemic's impact here, but we've certainly seen that accelerated furthermore from the pandemic. And then the third bucket of interoperability, which I think is the newest, is, as Ida mentioned, getting data directly into the hands of patients. And so instead of these B2B software applications that I was talking to in that second bucket, I think we're going to see an explosion of B2C applications where consumers can actually take hold of their data and turn that data into information with these new applications that will hopefully come to market as these new APIs are adopted and implemented and matured.
Mm-hmm. And you did kind of touch on what I wanted to ask about next, which was, during the pandemic, I think it's been clear that there's a need to make sharing information easier, both at the community level, between different health systems and partners. And then also, I know a lot of people, including myself, have used virtual visits for the first time during the last couple months. So I was wondering what that's looked like in the context of interoperability. So why don't you go ahead and start, Niko?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Redox, we have a really interesting view on the industry because we get to see the technologies that are being adopted and utilized by health systems. I'd say prior to the pandemic, virtual care and all of the novel technology that's necessary to enable it was really more of a nice to have. And now it's absolutely necessary to adopt these technologies to continue to meet patient needs and ultimately stay afloat financially as a healthcare organization. So it really shifted the need into rapid adoption. And so we saw that in Q2 of this year, where telehealth obviously is the big one that broke all the headlines in its massive adoption. And then starting in Q3 and now going into Q4, we're seeing a lot of that technology become like more stabilized within an organization. So Q2 is really rapid adoption. And then we started to see these applications become integrated, become rolled out enterprise-wide. We saw a lot of health systems adopt many different types of solutions. And so we're starting to see them kind of go back and cull all the technology and figure out what's going to work from an enterprise-wide perspective. So that's been a huge change that the pandemic has driven. Additionally, we're also seeing more collaboration between health systems, sharing resources and staff, which is, definitely not a traditional part of interoperability, but more, collaboration within a community, trying to take care of patients as cases arise. And then finally, there's sort of this new nationwide network that I think has been driven off of the pandemic, and that's with public health agencies. So Redox, for instance, our customer base, a lot of them shifted into COVID testing and we saw a lot of new COVID testing companies come about. And that forced us to create a nationwide network of public health agencies and departments of public health to report on COVID testing results. And so we have that nationwide network rolled out right now. And last week, for instance, we processed about 10% of all of the COVID tests nationwide. And that network didn't really exist before, something where you could, via API, report to all the public health agencies. And of course, that will transition to vaccine reporting as that rolls out across the country, hopefully soon. But yeah, that's some of the big changes that we've seen from the pandemic.
It sounds like you've been really busy during these last few months. So that's exciting to think about too, with the promise of vaccines coming soon. I also wanted to hear your perspective, Ida, on how you've sort of been thinking about interoperability during this time and kind of in the context of COVID-19 and what we've been seeing.
Yeah, I think there's interoperability, data interoperability, and then there's just using Zoom, right? So our system, we use Zoom to get our patients onto telehealth, and certainly, like everyone else, we had a lot of movement into that. I'm a primary care physician, and so our clinic moved in mass to Zoom. Have some data from August of this year, early August. 65% of our patients had a successful video visit. And by age groups, under 40 was 52% of them have, and of course, some of them just weren't coming in to see patients, right, to see doctors. The 41 to 64% age group was 65% had done a successful video visit. 65 to 79, 83% had a successful video visit, and 80 and over, 70% did. And I think what you're seeing there is that, the older population that has a lot of care needs do need to come and see us. And, certainly in my practice, people are their kids are driving over town, and showing up and setting up the iPad. And in the beginning, it was really quite rocky, but, when it comes to it, they're getting onto Zoom. My panel is mostly Chinese patients, and actually they are on Zoom just like everyone else. But I do worry very much about digital literacy and access to these technologies for many of our very underserved and marginalized populations. You have to know English to use Zoom. That's been a real challenge for families who don't have kids who speak English, for example. That's just been a real barrier. So I think this really highlights, as with everything else, the inequities in our system. And I think digital technology, is really part of that story as well. In terms of data interoperability, I think just looking forward as the vaccines start to roll in, and we're looking at the sort of not the 1A or the 1B, but the group 2 people, where we're saying, is it essential workers? Is it people with pre-existing conditions? And we're going to have people be vaccinated in pharmacies and, outreach into communities in a way that's trusted by the communities. Is it local churches, local community organizations? How are they going to know what your pre-existing condition is? You just come up and say, I have diabetes, and we take you on faith, right? How are we going to get that data out to people and out to the sort of the infrastructure for administering the vaccine in a way that's safe and equitable? So I think, some of the data interoperability challenges, I think, are still to come.
I wanted to remind anyone who's listening, feel free to drop any questions that you might have into the chat, and we'll get to them either through our conversation or at the end. But I think that's a great setup to kind of what we'll talk about in the future. Kevin, I also wanted to hear your perspective on this too, what you're sort of thinking about during this time.
Yeah, so I think one of the things too, you mentioned, COVID, and as Ida mentioned, she sees more, patients virtually. One of the things that I get to do in the Chief Scientist Division, which it's nerdy, but it's really, I think it's cool, and it's helping us think ahead for instance, in order to do precision medicine, we need more data that's just not within our EHR. We need data that's collected outside of the EHR to kind of tell us more of that full picture and that story. And that can be everything from social determinant of health data to perhaps data that comes from my Apple Watch or a medical device that I have maybe within my home, and even genomic data. And so we have several projects that we've done and continue to do at ONC. You know, one focus, we call it Sync for Genes, and it's focusing on the advancing standardization of genomic data, so that way it can be shared, you know, more interoperably between labs, providers, but also with patients. And Ida brings up a good point here. You know, and I know that there are a lot of really smart people who think broadly about kind of what are the both ethical, legal, scientific, you know, issues as it relates to sharing maybe certain types of data or information, if you will, and how do we share that, making sure that it is readable and it's understandable. And so that's some work that, you know, ONC's been doing with our Sync for Genes project, but we also have a project called Advancing Standards for Precision Medicine, and it just so happened we were ready to do our demonstration pilots, and we were looking to take, like, for instance, some simple wearable sensor data, like from a weight scale for individuals with congestive heart failure, or with another provider organization of collecting social determinant health data at telehealth check-in. It actually ended up being integrated into their pre-telehealth check-in process. But all this was done kind of rapidly on the fly, working with these small pilot sites who they themselves were technically trying to totally retool their systems. And I must say, I was so impressed with, you know, it's like one of those things, you know, calls of action in times of need, and you watch and you see people do amazing things and get stuff done through the technical kind of, I call it sweat equity. But we ended up expanding that pilot to include more data types, for instance, for our sensor mobile wearable data. But an issue is like, well, how do you get that data from those devices into perhaps the electronic health record and do it in a smart, sensible way? And we actually worked with Ida Sim and her group at Open M Health to do some of those important transformations, so that way data can get into the electronic health record. And it actually played an important role for one of our provider pilot sites. They were collecting, you know, real-time data from COVID patients who were at home, who might be at higher risk, so that way they can monitor them with like pulse oximeter, you know, weight, pulse, temperature, et cetera. And so by smartly being able to not just have that data be interoperable, that's one issue. The second issue is then like, well, how is it presented to the clinician as actual like useful information? And within the chief scientist division at ONC, like those are things that we are also thinking about, and how do we better automate some of those workflows? And again, a lot of this is done and is made possible though thanks to APIs and application programming interfaces, and the continuous work that we do to develop and advance standards that are out there, or harmonize standards, because there may be some competing standards out there. And so that's kind of where, you know, I get to sit in the work that I do, as far as we look at, you know, standards from different areas and coming from different, perhaps whether it's devices or other sources. And again, it'll be important. Ida and Niko both mentioned, for instance, with vaccines or working out with community centers. So, you know, leveraging our health information exchanges, our health information networks. These are infrastructures that have been developed over the past, you know, several years. And I think those will be key stakeholder groups to work with from a technology standpoint, as well as we think about policies for, you know, how to make sure that data flows.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to pick up, if I may, from Kevin's discussion there, that, you know, when we think of data interoperability, often we're thinking, as Niko very, very nicely laid out, sort of a B2B kind of data exchange, and perhaps, you know, moving forward as, you know, B2C kind of approaches. But there's really yet another piece to it, right? B to the clinician, to the C as the clinician, and that's really in getting that data into the workflow. And that's been a real challenge. You put that data into the, you know, EHR database, that's not going to do me any good as a clinician. It needs to come in front of my eyeballs as I'm seeing patients within my clinical workflow. And that's where I think the Smart on Fire standards have been really a great advance. I've been developing several Smart on Fire apps that show up within the clinical workflow without me needing to sign into a separate website or copy the MRN over or anything like that. So I think that really closes the loop. So the combination of the interoperability rules and the Smart on Fire technology, I think for the first time is allowing us to close that loop so that when the data is shared, it gets to where it really needs to go to impact care. So that's, I think, is a really exciting development that I would like to highlight for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And we actually got a question in our chat that I think is very closely related to what you brought up. So I thought I would just share this out here if you or the other panelists also want to respond to it. Someone was asking, when we have interoperability, the physician will have to sort through the enormous quantity of medical information that could continuously stream in. How will they handle this and the 5.9 hours of EHR time daily? And then they're asking how it will be handled with people who maybe can't read that particular language, or elderly people, or patients that might struggle using the technology. What solutions will be out there for them?
Yeah, I guess I'll just address the fire hose problem from the clinician side. I think it is really important that we look at the data coming in as clinical data for use in clinical decision making. So if it's blood pressure data, I need to see it as blood pressure data, not blood pressure data from a certain kind of cuff that I need to get, from a certain website, right? It just needs to be blood pressure data. I need to trust it. I need to have it in my workflow, and I need to be able to make decisions on it. As a primary care clinician, I think we need to be thinking very carefully about how this fire hose data comes into us, how it gets presented, so that in the end, I get good situational awareness about my patient's state and not be bombarded with a cacophony of just random pieces of data just because somebody, had some contract with some business and now the data is in front of my eyes. So I think we need to be thinking very much from the point of view of the user, what the cognitive requirements are, and design the visualization from the point of view of the user and not from the point of view of the person providing the data. And that, I think, is really challenging because our ecosystem is not set up that way. Businesses are not set up, to participate in a visualization where, the user is the one who really decides and should control what that visualization looks like. So I think there's going to be some transition in the ecosystem as we sort out these really, really challenging issues.
Yeah, and if I could just add in on that, a lot of times when we talk about interoperability, we're focusing on the data layer, the data transport layer. How do we get data from A to B? But where a user actually interacts with it is the application layer. And I think that's something that is largely under appreciated in this ecosystem of these are application developers who need to develop some tool that will surface the data in a way that's going to be most useful for the consumer of it. As Dr. Sim was mentioning, the user is what's most important here, and that's where the applications are going to thrive in from an innovation standpoint. So as a, if you're an entrepreneur out there, these are great opportunities to say, how do I actually take this huge set of data and hopefully it's available because interoperability has made great strides in providing a large set of longitudinal data for a patient. How do we surface what data is most applicable? And so you can see advancements in user interface design to do that, combined with AI to sift out what sort of data makes sense. But that's why applications make a lot of sense here. And it's funny, we talk about APIs frequently, but the A in APIs for applications, and those are the developers that actually need to utilize this data. And so that's a whole ecosystem of folks that need to actually figure out how to do this. And it's almost like a if we build it, they will come mindset. If we create this ecosystem of APIs and data that is available, then we're hoping, and Kevin mentioned this, that there's a an ecosystem of applications that compete against each other, and the best applications should float to the top of the ones that will be adopted by health systems. And some of those applications will be developed by EHR vendors, right? EHR vendors, beyond being the database and the facilitator of movement of that data, should also be competing for how do we surface that data appropriately. So we'll have people like Epic trying to build better ways to take data from a multitude of systems and surface it for their providers. And they should be competing on a level playing field with application providers, with a startup down the street that has developed something and allowing a provider to use that to look at the data as well.
Niko's absolutely right on that. And one of the things that we've done at ONC is, and one of the projects I'm leading is advancing the use of APIs for scientific discovery, in the sense of being like, what do application developers, someone who might be coming into this field and say, I'm looking to maybe get into healthcare, what do they need to know kind of about the space itself? And it's a tricky kind of cobweb of different things. And through demonstration projects, which I think ONC is really good about doing and funding, such as this, we had Sync for Science, which was a way that people to use an application programming interface or an application, and then using the API to connect to their electronic health record, and then share their data with the National Institutes of Health's All of Us research program as just like a use case. But the experience of having them, an application developer, go and try to do this with a EHR provider, it provided a lot of great insight, lessons learned. And, us as a government agency, we do our best not to just share that information back with the standard development organizations and those who create implementation guides, but also on our website and feedback. And we, as I mentioned, as part of this project accelerating APIs for scientific discovery, we're actually going out and we're talking to a variety of stakeholder groups to get their input, again, to just help illuminate kind of this field of what is healthcare applications, what are APIs, and the idea is hopefully to fertilize a bit of this ground so that way better competition can take place. And certainly considering aspects that Ida brought up too, the kind of the fire hose problem of this, am I going to get a barrage of data in that's not useful to me? And so one of our leading edge acceleration projects in health IT that we have, a couple of them, is designed. We purposefully put in requirements that when they design their applications or their products or whatever their IT innovation is going to be, it has to be open source, so it's shareable, and they have to consider workflow, user design aspects. So that way the tool does hopefully seamlessly kind of integrate into the provider or whomever that end user is. So information is there and provided in a smart way. And we found that, as Ida mentioned as well, the Smart on Fire kind of APIs and apps through one of our leading edge acceleration projects at MedStar was able to take a standalone tool that was outside of the EHR and embed it, and did a lot of important user-centered design and feedback to reiterate kind of the development of this product or this app that now lives at in MedStar's Cerner electronic health record. Because it's Smart on Fire, technically anybody should be able to go grab it and utilize it regardless, agnostic of their EHR system. And we have the code, the source code, as well as kind of the development toolkit on ONC's GitHub page. And so it's an example of ways that this can be done. But I think both Niko and Dr. Sim bring up very important things as we look forward with applications and ensuring that we're letting the field and the industry know that there are important aspects to consider once we have this great interoperable data, that it does actually become useful information at the point of care that's relevant.
I also wanted to bring up, kind of on the subject of APIs, I know we've talked some about the process of bringing that into the workflow and making sure that these are really usable. I was also really interested in what Niko kind of referred to as the third, or the newer bucket, which is the consumer-facing applications and the ability for people to bring their health information to an app, for example, and carry that with them. And so I thought I would start with you, Ida, because I know that you've done some really interesting work with the Commons project, just a little bit about what that looks like, what goes into that, and then how you kind of consider privacy, security, and trust in that as well.
Sure, thank you for that. So I've been working with a new nonprofit organization called the Commons Project. Commons Project was launched about a year ago with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. And the problem, the opportunity that we saw was that many of you know that Apple Health records, you can use Apple Health to bring your EHR data, your own EHR data onto your iPhone. And that was in 2018, and yet there was no Android equivalent. And of course, we know people who use Android tend to have a different socioeconomic status than Apple users. But it just seemed like a big gap in the ecosystem that we didn't have an equivalent. And so the Commons Project, TCP, built out something called Common Health, which is an app toolkit for Android. And which allows you then to use Common Health on your Android phone to authenticate to a health system and pull your own medical records down onto your own Android phone. UCSF was the first institution to connect. We worked closely with TCP to iron out all the challenges of using the FHIR API to do that. It does bring down the US core data interoperability data set, as Kevin mentioned earlier. And we just earlier this last week announced at the ONC meeting, we have 230 health institutions already connected to Common Health. It will be 340 by January. I think there's well over 600 on Apple, but essentially it's going to be where you can use either your Android or your Apple phone, put in credentials for Epic, for example. It will be your MyChart credentials, and you will get your US core data set about you on your own phone. LabCorp is also part of Common Health now. So really creating this person-centered health data ecosystem. And we will be bringing wearables data into that as well. So now the patient has their own data on their phone. And from there, what Niko and Kevin were talking about, that data can now flow to third-party apps. And I think that is super, super exciting because really, I'm in primary care. We have chronic diseases. 60% of Americans have one chronic disease. 40% have two or more chronic diseases. Care happens by people taking care of themselves. And, we need to use our technology to help people to do that self-care. And, they need the EHR data to do that. And so I think this Common Health and Apple Health approach is going to bring people's EHR data into the app ecosystem in a way that individual companies can then exploit and compete on to provide greater value. So I think that's super, super exciting. Niko and Kevin have explained that very well. I think one of the biggest threats is going to be trust. So the privacy framework and the trust framework is going to be extremely, extremely important. And that's actually why we developed Common Health as part of a nonprofit organization. The Commons Project, TCP, is a public trust. It's a 501c3. We are not, trying to favor one part of the ecosystem over another. It's really making a level playing field that establishes a level of trust and community accountability, and then with standards as well, OpenM Health and other standards, so that data can be flowing through the ecosystem with trust and with integrity. And if we can make that a level playing field, then I think many other groups, commercial and otherwise, can be built on that to really advance both clinical care and also research.
I also wanted to kind of hand this question over to Niko, how you're sort of thinking about trust, and security and privacy in your work with interoperability too.
Yeah, for sure. So right now, millions of medical records are shared with software developers and applications without the patient knowing about it. And that's the current paradigm that healthcare data is exchanged in, and it's done through back office deals called business associate agreements under the HIPAA guidelines, where two organizations, a software vendor and a health system, are shaking hands and saying that we're working together, and in order to work together, we need to share protected health information with each other. And so right now, that's the paradigm that most interoperability, or a lot of interoperability, works within, at least on the kind of integration side with applications. And so that's how Redox shares data. And I think it's kind of scary that, we share about 12 million patient records a day with applications, and none of those patients know that Redox has their data. None of those patients could track that if they wanted to, and it's because of how these businesses work together, and it's necessary in order to get the data from Epic to Teladoc for that telehealth visit, and so those are the types of data exchanges that we're doing today. The new paradigm around patient authorized data is really flipping it on its head. It's a fundamental paradigm shift in how data should be exchanged. And I think it's really the right side of history, right? Patients should know where their data is. They should be the center of that, brokering the exchange of their data, and saying who should have it and who should not have it. And that's what I'm really excited about for this new world. But I think in order for it to be successful, there's a few things that have yet to be figured out. First and foremost, the data that is currently mandated for patient access, the US CDI set of data is by the calculations that we did at Redox, that only covers about 20% of digital health use cases that we're currently seeing. And of course, the challenge is on to accelerate the use cases that is made available to patients under these APIs. But right now, for a lot of these applications, they're probably going to have a foot in both worlds, where they might start their workflow off using these types of APIs to get the data, but they'll likely also need to be interacting with other types of interfacing and interoperability technology, such as older standards like HL7 and all of the technology overhead that comes with that. So hopefully we can increase the amount of data that's available over those APIs. So I think that's definitely a challenge. And then the other really big thing is what are these apps, right? Like, there's not really for lack of a better term, a killer healthcare app out there right now that is actually going to drive a lot of the consumer adoption. So these apps need to be developed by entrepreneurs. We need to be, testing and innovating in the market to actually create applications that are going to engage patients. Because if we look at patient portals right now, which is kind of the primary clinical healthcare application, the adoption of them is pretty poor. And actually pre-pandemic was even worse. The pandemic has actually accelerated that dramatically because of the necessity of virtual care. But what applications are actually going to hold patients' attentions? And if I think about, other industry corollaries, like looking at the financial industry, we had Mint.com come about, and that was kind of the first consumer financial application that got a lot of consumer attention and really drove the innovation in the space for more and more applications. Healthcare is very different from finance in the ways that consumers interact with the data, and so there's going to be need for very different type applications built on top of things like the Common Health Project and on top of Apple's APIs and the whole ecosystem of Fire APIs that enable that to happen. So I think, we both need more data, and with these APIs, we need consolidated ways to get access to them, and we need the application community to develop these applications. With all of those stars aligned, I think we're going to have a really interesting future as far as interoperability goes, and a patient's ability to access their data and be the broker of it across multiple care settings.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that too, kind of behind the scenes, one of the things that, obviously is also important is not just, do I have the data and a lot of this information that we do get. Prior to that, it has to go from data to information, it's synthesized, and then it can become actual evidence and knowledge. And ONC and the Chief Scientist Division, we earlier this year came out with our Health IT Priorities for Research, a policy and development agenda, and it outlines a lot of different things that kind of need to happen in order for us to better intersect our clinical care and our research systems in healthcare, which is so important. And one of the important things that I would say, maybe behind the scenes, people may not think about, but certain applications, whether it's business to business or business to consumer, and the things they're going to run on that's so important is AI. So, artificial intelligence, machine learning. But when you think about those things, it's not just like they just work. They have to be tested and developed, and they need to be tested and developed using hopefully high quality data. And healthcare data is not always high quality. And so one of the things that we're doing at ONC is we have a project we found, again, through those health IT priorities for research, was things like maybe developing metadata standards and advancing the use of metadata could certainly help improve data quality, and then make it easier for others to be able to use that data, and again, to be innovative, as well as hopefully drive that information so it can be synthesized and curated a lot easier and faster. And then that way we can come to evidence and knowledge, and hopefully close that loop, return it back to the point of care in ways that make sense in the clinical workflow, or even on the patient side of things, or for a caregiver. And that's, when I look on the far horizon of, where you hope and you hear buzzwords like learning healthcare system, precision medicine. I mean, ultimately, that's where a lot of this initial important early work is hopefully funneling us towards that direction.
I would echo also the importance of standards for the newer kinds of data. We talked about the electronic health record data being just one kind of data. Patient-generated data is certainly another one, and that covers, your wearables, your home monitors, your Internet of Things, and then there's just sort of environmental data, right? That's relevant to our health. As we have fires here in Northern California, so the AQI was certainly very relevant to health, and we need standards for those kinds of data as well. So OpenM Health is a nonprofit that I co-founded that is, has open standards for mobile health data. We're actually successfully balloted as an IEEE standard, so we will be a global standard very, very soon. And part of that standard does include metadata. I think that's a huge, huge issue that we need to start getting into. We can work on standardizing format and then standardizing semantics with, annotation to LOINC or SNOMED, but really we need to know where this data comes from. What was the algorithm that generated it? This is a digital biomarker. Well, what data came in? What are the error bounds around that algorithm? Will I know if the algorithm got swapped out, from under me as I get this data stream? So we need to be thinking about the metadata infrastructure, and that perhaps is really the next super, super important frontier for data interoperability, because we're looking at data that's being used, for clinical care and for clinical research. And if we can't assure ourselves of the quality and the provenance of our data, then we're building upon a very rickety foundation.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. And I also really liked the point that you brought up about all these other, especially environmental health data. Something we thought about a lot recently with the fires and other things too. I know we're down to the last couple of minutes and we have a couple audience questions, so I wanted to bring those in really quickly. One person asked about the different roles for interoperability in terms of getting access into the hands of patients or members. What roles will different healthcare players take, such as payers or health systems? If any of you want to take that.
Is that, was the regulations mentioned in that, or just kind of in general from an ecosystem standpoint?
I think it was just in general from an ecosystem standpoint.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of it is driven off of regulations, because health systems now, as users of certified EHR technology, are have to actually use technology that releases data to patients, with upcoming deadlines. And so they're all trying to figure out how to make sure that infrastructure is in place. I think one of the really exciting things that we've been seeing is a change in mindset, because in the past, we used to see providers and EHR vendors have kind of a paternalistic view over the data that they generate and that they utilize, in the sense that they said, if we give this data to patients, what are they going to do with it? Will they be able to find it useful? Could it actually be harmful? And the government has made a pretty clear view on that the data needs to go to the patient, and it's not really the choice of the providers or EHR vendors. And so we've seen sort of a mental model shift in their mind, saying, okay, this has to happen. This is where the industry is going. And then subsequently a shift in how the technology will enable that. And I think the new rules influenced by 21st Century Cures Act is the first time payers have been brought into the mix, saying that payers have a lot of data on patients too, and patients need to have access to that. So it's interesting because traditionally Redox had never really talked to the payers, and now we're getting a ton of interest from payers saying, how can we utilize your APIs to actually release this data in a compliant way, because they don't have an equivalent of an EHR that they use. So really making that transition in the payer space is an interesting thing that the government has really influenced through these regulations.
I think it's a question also about not just technically how does a health system make their data available to comply with regulations, but how would we partners with our patients in helping them understand and make use of the data in a way that really is a benefit overall. And I think we're really struggling with that. We're overwhelmed already, as many of you know, in delivering care. This seems like an additional thing that we need to do. But I think it is incumbent upon us to really be partners with our patients in this new world, not just leave them alone, right? But there are a lot of implications on what that means that we have to do. Similar to the shift that Niko's talking about on the both on the payer and the provider side is patients. I've been doing some work, with the Common Health Project with others, and I think patients are just used to thinking that this is not my data. This is the data that belongs to the health record. I'm just, sending it to some other doctor to help me, but they're not seeing that this is my data. I have agency over the data, and I can do something with this data for myself. That's a big, big shift. And I think that's going to take some time to happen. But yeah, depending on what kind of killer apps there are, that shift will start to happen. But right now it's very much, you want me to have this data, doc? Sure, I'll take it. What do you want me to do with it? How can I help you with this data? It is not the how do I help myself. So I think that shift is yet to happen.
We also have a question about FHIR in the chat. Will the standards committee make FHIR bidirectional?
So I'll go ahead and I'll say this is something, and I think just from, out of the Chief Scientist Division is certainly I've been thinking about, and hopefully we'll see some work coming out of ONC in the near future. Again, like I said, we do a lot of pilots and demonstrating and just kind of hoping to get started and working with our SDO groups, standard development organizations, and demonstration groups. And I can say it's certainly an aspect that I'm myself am curious in, and I know that ONC is going to be taking a look at. We had our kind of like a year in review looking at APIs and apps. ONC had an event last week, and I think it should be recorded and available online if people want to go back. And that certainly came up was this idea of bidirectional, or we talk about API read write, because right now it's just API read, but it is going to be an important part because again, we're going to leverage and utilize these applications to stay connected, not just with patients and caregivers but patients with their clinician. And that means getting information back, not just by email, but potentially other things. And we've already kind of demonstrated some of this work by, like, for instance, sharing patient-generated health data back into the EHR. That requires the app to be able to go in, access, and then write back to the EHR, so then it is captured and can become part of that record. So we've done some initial work there. We're going to continue to do work because just like all things, that's where the road is leading. So
yeah, this is what I was talking about with people needing to have a foot in both worlds, where we should be using FHIR and adopting it, but it's not going to meet all of the use cases just yet. So that's really important for developers, as they're thinking about building an application, what sort of standards to be adopting. I would suggest continuing to adopt FHIR, but then also needing to understand that it's not going to meet all of the use cases, like writing back in, like updating a patient, like sending an order, things like that. With Redox, you can actually write with FHIR because we translate it back into HL7. So it's been a huge demand, and it's something that a lot of the middle layer companies, I think, will pick up until the standards are mandated and more mature, or actually mandated by government bodies.
I think that's most of the questions we had in the chat. I don't know if anyone else had any they wanted to drop in. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time. I think this was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your afternoons today to join us.
Thank you, Elise, so much for moderating, and thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate you contributing your time out of your busy day to take part in this conference, and we value your participation. So thank you, Dr. Ida Sim, Niko Skievaski, and Kevin Chaney. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be seeing each other in person in the not too distant future for one of Redox's famous receptions. Thank you so much to our speakers and our audience. We look forward to seeing you at the next MedCity Invest Precision Medicine session.